The uncalled medical defence witness in the Lucy Letby case, Dr. Mike Hall, has become increasingly vocal in raising his concerns about the fairness of the Lucy Letby trial. Most recently, on Thursday 12 September, it was reported in The Guardian that he has written to Lady Justice Thirlwall to say it is incorrect to say that criticism of the trial is only coming from those outside the trial, as he attended every day of the trial apart from a couple of afternoons for which he was provided transcripts. Until Letby's defence counsel speak out, it remains a mystery as to why Dr. Hall wasn't called. One obvious issue is that responsibility would have fallen on one individual to rebuke a litany of charges, some verging on matters such as toxicology, which are on the periphery of his expertise. A further issue is that there have been problems getting medical experts willing to speak for the defence in cases in the UK. For instance, this is former medical defence expert Wayne Squire speaking in 2018.
Back in 2005, Linda had 7 medical experts to support her. Today, she would be likely to have none.
Before taking up the case pro bono, Mark MacDonald, Letby's new defence barrister, was also talking about the difficulty in finding medical experts willing to testify for the defence.
Doctors will not give evidence for the defence in cases involving child abuse. Simply can't find them.
In terms of funding or legal aid, I've heard mixed reports. Lawyer and legal commentator Tim Owen has said he believes the defence budget would typically allow for 6 expert witnesses.
No one suggested, for example, that the Legal Aid Authority refused to extend legal aid.
On the other hand, Professor Jane Hutton, who has significant legal experience as a medical statistician, has pointed out the funding allowed per witness is, in her experience, usually lopsided.
Bar counsel or regulators saying that in the defence of murder there was a cap of about 30,000 for the barristers on legal aid.
A theory for why the defence didn't call Mike Hall is perhaps overconfidence in the extent to which they had undermined the prosecution witnesses during cross-examination. A further idea has been put forward by legal blogger David Alan Green in a blog article which I will link in the description if you haven't seen it. At various points during the first trial, the Letby defence team tried to get prosecution witness Dowie Evans barred from giving evidence. They also tried at one stage to bring a motion of no case to answer. The, you could call it legal theory put forward by David Alan Green, is that if no expert evidence exists in an area, it would not make sense to engage in the prosecution's speculation. As it was the job of the prosecution to prove the allegations, the defence was saying it's very hard to prove unprecedented events. Some of the quotes Hall has made to the media suggest this theory has merit. For instance, taking this quote from the New Yorker, he, as in Hall, wondered if his testimony was seen as too much of a risk. One of the questions they would have asked me is, why did this baby die? And I would have had to say, I'm not sure. I don't know. That's not to say that therefore the baby died of an air embolism. Just because we don't have an explanation doesn't mean we're going to make one up. The viability of the various air attacks used by Letby have been questioned by experts outside the trial. Private Eye's medical correspondent Phil Hammond has described it as problematic, putting these potential air attacks to a jury when experts he has consulted struggle to completely understand them.
So if you're sitting there in the jury, there's this really complex stuff going on about air embolism, which nobody really understands, and could this be a cause of death?
Something that I think gets misconstrued about the trial is that just because there are a lot of witnesses on the prosecution side, it doesn't mean they gave ringing endorsements of the prosecution case. If you look at this excerpt from the Court of Appeal ruling, paragraph 228, number 3, Roman numerals, quote, Professor Kinsey accepted that air embolus was not part of her expertise. Number 4, Roman numerals, quote, Professor Arthurs admitted he had no clinical experience with air embolus. Roman numerals number 5, quote, Dr. Marnarines could not or would not explain the mechanism by which air embolus causes death in a neonate. There is a letter Professor Hall has written to the British Medical Journal where he is critical about the prosecution's claims about air emboli, but for balance I think I should acknowledge these quotes which he gave to the Times publication. I would have given different answers to those given by the prosecution's medical expert witnesses, and different interpretations for some of the cases. That's not to say that I know all the answers, or that I know that Lucy Letby is innocent. There were certainly some events which were difficult to explain, but the evidence, in my view, was open to challenge. Before getting into Hall's criticisms, I should recap some of the prosecution case on air emboli, going by BBC court reporter Dan O'Donoghue's tweets, referring to evidence given by consultant paediatrician Ravi Jayaram, given on February 22nd, 2023, quoting Dr. Jayaram, in June 2016, after a number of further unusual, unexpected and inexplicable events on the neonatal unit, the whole consultant body sat down and thought we have to work out what's going on here. The story goes that at the consultant meeting, it was consultant paediatrician Stephen Breary who noticed the association between Letby's shift pattern and a number of incidents. Dr. Ravi Jayaram heard talk about air emboli, which directed him to this semi-famous paper co-authored by Shu Lee, Pulmonary Vascular Air Embolism in a Newborn. In court on February 22nd, 2023, Ravi Jayaram would say it, as in the conversations they had been having, prompted me to do a literature search, as in of the medical literature. I remember sitting at home with my iPad researching. I remember the physical chill that went down my spine when I read that, because it fitted with what we were seeing. The fitted with what we were seeing from Dr. Jayaram likely refers to a couple of clinical features, but one very significant and controversial one is a pink flitting rash or discoloration. The prosecution theory is that Letby injects air into a vein which travels around the body and can be seen to somebody on the outside as pink discoloration of the body. Eventually the air bubble stops moving around the body and forms a clot, similar to a blood clot, which causes severe issues for the neonates. However, there is some controversy as to who is the originator of the air embolism theory or diagnosis, depending on how you want to think about it. Letby defense barrister Ben Myers had this conversation with prosecution witness Dowie Evans in court 3 weeks after Ravi Jayaram said he felt the physical chill go down his spine after reading about the paper on air embolisms. Mr. Myers went on, at some point before you started writing reports, you were told by the police about suspicious rashes and air embolus, weren't you? Dr. Evans said, that is completely untrue. It's totally untrue. The first time I heard a local doctor mention air embolus was a couple of weeks ago. The first person I know to raise the area of air embolus was me. I did that in case number 1, and I thought, oh my God, what is going on here? My perception is there are some red herrings and confusion about how well the phenomenon of air embolus is understood. I mentioned earlier that Phil Hammond, who has been in contact with leading neonatologists, struggles to find someone who understands it.
There's this really complex stuff going on about air embolism, which nobody really understands, and could this be a cause of death?
David Davis, who has also been conducting a review into the Letby case, has also pointed out that a complete or near complete understanding of air embolus requires an advanced level of knowledge.
And it's not something that you read in a normal textbook.
In the same interview, Davis also points to an absence of evidence of Letby researching air embolisms, despite her internet search history coming under scrutiny at the trial.
There's no sign of her searching, for example, air embolism.
However, what came out at the trial is that Letby did have some training in air embolisms. Looking at the court report from the Chester Standard on 18th May 2023, where Letby is being prosecuted by Nick Johnson. Just under the 1216 timestamp, there's a link to this Chester Standard report in the description. Letby is being asked about her training, which when completed allowed her to care for intensive care babies. The training involved education about lines, access, and the complication of air embolus, the court hears. Letby said she had heard of air embolus by the time the police interviewed her. However, the way I understand it, and please let me know if you have training in using intravenous lines, is that this training course would have considered things like what are the best veins to insert a line into, different lines for different veins, probably some practical training in terms of developing the sleight of hand for line insertion, plus a general awareness that you don't want to get any air into a vein. However, the prosecution seized on this training in the use of lines and knowledge of air embolus to then say she must be a master of air embolus, to the point where she can be a stealth attacker who knows the exact amount of air to blast into a vein, such that she can use an air blast to sabotage a baby and yet distance herself from the attack. However, when I get onto the letter by Professor Hall later, you'll be able to see that even amongst the senior doctors, consultant and expert witnesses, there is confusion about what happens when air is injected into a vein. There is a universal agreement that it's not a good idea, but the exact pattern of discoloration and the quantities of air involved, scaled to a baby, are in dispute. One case where the prosecution play on a supposedly devious and yet likely unrealistic knowledge of air embolus relates to child I. The following is going to come from the Chester Standard Court Report on 10th February 2023, and it relates to evidence given by Dr. Sandie Bohin. Something to note about Dr. Sandie Bohin is that unlike defense witness Professor Mike Hall and some of the prosecution witnesses, she is one of the witnesses at the trial who has a controversial reputation. Dr. Bohin was named in Parliament in Guernsey for her role in safeguarding, aka use of social services, by Deputy Gavin St. Pierre. I will get into this a bit later in the video, but multiple families involved put forward a statement where they accused Dr. Bohin of, quote, a sinister and sickening abuse of power. From the Chester Standard Court Report on 10th February 2023, just above the 11:30 a.m. timestamp. For the October 13th incident, in which Dr. Bohin says air was administered via the nasogastric tube and via a vein, Dr. Bohin had said she believed the apnea machine had been switched off or tampered with. So to recap, the prosecution are alleging that Letby is injecting air via a vein, which they suggest is a cunning and devious attack method, as it can serve as a biological time bomb of sorts. To give an example of the way Letby's training in lines was misrepresented at the first trial, I'm going to refer to the Chester Standard Court Reports and a YouTuber called Crime Scene to Courtroom, who apparently attended most of the first trial. The YouTuber Crime Scene to Courtroom has this video where he's talking about a Freudian slip from Lucy Letby. Chester Standard Court Reports, 25th of May 2023. Just above the 3:35 timestamp, there's a link to this day in the description. Mr. Johnson asked how Letby could spot something Ashley Hudson could not, as mentioned from her police interview. Letby responds by saying, I had more experience, so knew what I was looking for. She then falters and corrects herself. Nick Johnson responds by saying suspiciously, what do you mean looking for? The implication here is that Letby, having caused the collapse, is now identifying the features which she has caused. The alternative explanation is that as Ashley Hudson had less experience, it could be logical that Letby could identify clinical features that she may have overlooked. Letby then says, "I don't mean it like that. I'm finding it hard to concentrate." And the judge called an end to the day shortly after that. I think, if anything, the day ending so soon after that probably drew more attention to the incident. The problem here is that the observable features of a venous air embolism are disputed between the defense witnesses Shuley and Mike Hall in comparison to what the prosecution witnesses Ravi Jayaram, Dowie Evans and Sandie Bohin say should be seen. Therefore, the idea that Letby would have this deep understanding of this attack method seems unlikely. You could say, to play devil's advocate, that she may have learned about this attack method as she has been on an active killing spree and used it several times. Prosecutor Nick Johnson apparently made a big thing out of Letby's apparent Freudian slip during the prosecution's closing speech. What I find surprising is that this play on words of knowing what to look for, which seems to me to be of a very low evidential value, made it into the judge's summing up. Going by the court report from the Chester Standard, July 5th, they make a reference to the judge's comment. In her evidence, she was asked how she could spot child eye, quote, "She knew what she was looking for," end quote, which she corrected to "at," the judge says. Commenting from my lowly position, the fact that the judge did include this in his summing up is to me something that's suggestive of a degree of incompetence on his part. Remember, the defense have tried to bring a motion of no case to answer on air embolism, which the judge is supposed to have evaluated. He might have seen a lot of Google hits on air embolism, but precise descriptions of what happens are harder to come by. So now to look at the letter Mike Hall has written to the British Medical Journal about the Letby trial. The first point that I'm going to single out is that the Shuley paper is cited 25 times in the prosecution reports, which I think is a way of Hall saying that it was a very important paper in terms of their case. However, Dr. Hall points out this was an inappropriate reference for several reasons. Firstly, because it describes air being injected at high pressure, and secondly, because the air is pure oxygen, whereas Letby is accused of using room air, which would include large amounts of nitrogen. Hall makes a further point. Except for one specific type of skin appearance, the skin discolorations in the Letby case are as likely, and probably more likely, to have been caused by circulatory impairment associated with sudden collapse, rather than the specific effect of air or oxygen in the baby's circulation. Hall also says, "I have found only one paper which describes specific skin changes associated with the accidental, or in Letby's case, allegedly intentional injection of air." He cites in the references to his letter this paper, "Paraplegia due to peripheral venous air embolus in a neonate." In that paper, they find that after a baby is injected with air into a vein, the baby's back turns blue for several hours. Remember, throughout the trial, the discoloration was usually a moving pink rash. I think it's more subtle than the video I've been using, but you get the idea. According to the information Dr. Hall can find, the symptoms for air being injected into a vein are very different to those described at the trial. Hall also disagrees with the prosecution witnesses in terms of how they described the health of the babies, based off what he said to Phil Hammond.
He thinks the babies were actually far sicker than the prosecution portrayed.
So having seen that there is disagreement between the prosecution and defense witnesses, something to consider is how does Hall's reputation compare to the prosecution witnesses? The two witnesses I'm going to focus on are Sandie Bohin and Dowie Evans. As I said, there are other prosecution witnesses, but they have a much less prominent role in the prosecution case. As far as I can tell, Professor Mike Hall has a very good reputation. Sandie Bohin, in contrast, is known for her involvement in something called the Guernsey safeguarding scandal. There are several ways of interpreting this safeguarding scandal. The story of the aggrieved families is that they had sick children who struggled to find an accurate diagnosis. When they asked for a second opinion or kicked up a fuss, they were referred to various agencies such as CAMHS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, the police, children's social care, and school attendance services. The process would be going on allegedly for years, with none of the families aware of the treatment the other families were receiving. One day, however, the medical specialist group in Guernsey would apparently pick the wrong patient to jerk around. Guernsey Member of Parliament Deputy Gavin St. Pierre's daughter would develop an illness. His GP would refer them to a specialist who the GP thought would be able to help. What instead would happen is it sounds like some kind of arguments and difficulty in making an accurate diagnosis that would lead to St. Pierre's daughter being referred to one of the social service type organisations which I have mentioned previously. These events would take place in 2015. Several years later, Deputy St. Pierre would become aware of several other families who had bad experiences with safeguarding. He would hold a meeting with these families and the responsible officer, which I think is some kind of overseer of safeguarding.
In that meeting, Deputy St. Pierre told the responsible officer that Dr. Bohin had weaponised the safeguarding service, that he wanted her sacked and he wanted her head on a stick.
You could argue that's the kind of attitude a lot of parents would have if someone started messing with their daughter, although Deputy Peter Fairbash, who was speaking there, argued that this was a sign of an inappropriate or unprofessional vendetta against Dr. Bohin. Deputy Gavin St. Pierre would go on to use parliamentary privilege to raise concerns about the potential weaponisation of the safeguarding process, raising the issue in Parliament in April 2022.
The families did not know each other at all before this process began, but since then, another 10 families have come forward.
However, Dr. Bohin would fight back, saying, "Deputy St. Pierre named me in a wholly irresponsible manner, and I consider his doing so was reckless, irresponsible, and fundamentally wrong." She got support from 18 local doctors, which was the majority, although it was still a divisive issue, which would in turn spark an investigation into whether St. Pierre had abused parliamentary privilege. There was enough evidence that St. Pierre's concerns were genuine for him to survive this parliamentary privilege inquiry. St. Pierre would then call for an independent inspection of the medical specialist group.
Let's face it, if there's nothing to hide, then what is there to fear from that independent inspection?
The results of the abusive privilege inquiry and the internal investigation would actually amplify the tension between Dr. Bohin and Gavin St. Pierre, as reported on a Guernsey radio station.
Deputy St. Pierre did more recently make further accusations against Dr. Bohin relating to his daughter's care.
Dr. Bohin would herself fight back, saying she was extremely disappointed that Deputy Gavin St. Pierre wasn't sanctioned for abuse of parliamentary privilege. She would also go on to say, quote, "The inference was I had harmed a child, which as a paediatrician is a terrible accusation." Bohin firing back at St. Pierre would in turn outrage the families, several of whom would come together to make a joint statement.
As the parents of seriously ill children, instead of being supported in our quest to find solutions and treatment, we were blocked from seeking second opinions and private consultations.
That clip is from a Guernsey radio station, which I will leave a link to in the description, and I have been quoting throughout this video. I will also include links to a couple of media articles which also contain these quotes.
Not only were we blocked, we were persecuted by being put through traumatic and needless investigations, questioning our ability to care for our own children.
To recap, as I understand it, the persecution in this case refers to the referrals to these various agencies and the police.
To have our intentions and actions questioned was a sinister and sickening abuse of power which should have never been allowed to happen.
So to an extent, the controversy with Dr. Bohin is a he said, she said. However, I think it's interesting to note that she has a controversial reputation, whereas Michael has a solid reputation. With the Letby case being such a high-profile case, there being extensive court reports and some getting a hold of the transcripts, I expect Dr. Bohin will be judged on the statements she made under oath. Amazingly, the witness who would be considered Hall's other direct counterpart in this case, Dr. Dowie Evans, also has a controversial background with social services. I covered this more in my last video.
Because it was kidnapping, but it was kidnapping by the state.
So in conclusion, the legal position allowed some of the bad character evidence against Dr. Evans to be admissible. However, there is some evidence that the bad character evidence against Drs. Evans and Bohin goes well beyond what was shown in the courtroom. In terms of getting to the truth of what really happened, Dr. Mike Hall seems to be by far the most credible witness, and he has major issues with the explanations which were offered at the criminal trial. The reasons why Dr. Mike Hall was not called are a mystery. Personally, I wonder if he would perhaps have been seen as a liability on the insulin charges, as they are not really his area, even if he could have rebuked other charges. Until the defense counsel speak out, it is all speculation.